Is Turkey's president under threat? Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his AK party suffer unprecedented defeats in local elections. After years of consolidating power, how big a shock has he suffered? And how can he recover? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme today with me, Peter Dobbie. Recep Tayyip Erdogan has dominated politics in Turkey for the past 16 years, but after winning every election since then, his AK party suffered a setback in Sunday's local elections. Voters apparently particularly fed up with what critics say is his increasingly autocratic rule, as well as the falling value of the Turkish lira, rising inflation and higher unemployment. The Justice and Development Party lost control in major cities, including Izmir and the capital, Ankara. Mr. Erdogan's challenging the opposition's result there and in Turkey's biggest city, Istanbul. From there, Jamal El-Shal has more.
After almost 2 decades of constant losses, Turkey's opposition finally has reason to celebrate. The People's Republican Party, or CHP, won the mayoral position in the capital, Ankara, and, it would seem, is on course to capture Istanbul, Turkey's largest and most populous city.
Let Turkey be happy now. Let Istanbul be happy and get back to normal. We had 7 elections in 5 years. Let's get back to work now and serve the people. Just as we start today, we will run the city in a transparent fashion at every moment. I'm doing this happily, and I know that every part of the city belongs to 16 million people.
It was the first major position held by Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who used it to launch his political career nationally. Losing it is a personal blow to the president.
Every victory and every loss is the will of our nation, and we have to accept this fact as a necessity of democracy. We will admit that we won people's hearts in cities we won, but we were not successful enough in cities we lost, and we will act accordingly.
Despite the losses in some of the big cities like Antalya and Adana, Erdogan still managed to win more than half the votes counted across the country. And nationally, it's retained the largest number of mayors too. But the Turkish people appear to have directed their frustration with the faltering economy at the ruling party, which has led the country uninterrupted for 17 years.
What was promised on June 24th was, if you don't want the country to have economic problems, vote for the presidential coalition led by the president.
President Erdogan says the people have spoken and that he has listened. He knows that things need to change and that he and his party must come up with solutions to fix the country's economy and address the concerns of those who didn't vote for the AK party. The opposition will now be tested to see if it can deliver better governance in the positions it won from the AKP. At a time when Erdogan's been accused of being autocratic, Sunday's elections are a demonstration that democracy is still very much alive in Turkey. Jamal El-Shal, Al Jazeera, Istanbul.
OK, let's get going. Let's bring in our guests. Joining us on Skype from Istanbul is Mehmet, Celik, managing editor for the daily Sabah newspaper. Ege Seckin is a Turkey specialist for IHS Country Risk. He joins us from London. And finally, Ozgur Unlaisachikli is the Ankara office director of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. He joins us from the Turkish capital. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Mehmet, in Istanbul, if I can come to you first, was this a protest vote or something else?
Well, I think it is a message definitely given to the AK party as a party. But I think if we look at the results, I don't think we should come to a conclusion that this is, like your question is, I think, posing a protest vote against President Erdogan himself, because if we look at the June 24th elections, when we held the votes for presidential and parliamentary elections, we saw that the party itself still received less votes than the President Erdogan himself. So in the local elections right now, we see that 51.5 to 52% nearly vote is still there for the President Erdogan and the party. Although this is, again, part of an alliance, setting. However, in June 24 elections and also hours after the most of the votes were counted, President Erdogan this time around again said that there will be some self-evaluation made, and the party has taken the lessons that needs to be taken into consideration for an evaluation and assessment for the party to come up and face the challenges or some of the needs that needs to be addressed for a better performance next time. So I don't know if we can call it a protest vote, but of course, the loss of, let's say, the capital city and some of the other cities is a major shift. However, in Istanbul, things are not as clear yet. So I think once things settle down in Istanbul, then there will be a better chance to say that whether or not this was a protest vote. But right now, I don't think AK Party is a clear winner of the elections, receiving most of the votes. The fact that CHP has gained votes has not necessarily affected AK Party's overall votes in the country. So I think maybe we can say, yes, CHP has gained ground given its alliance and given its maybe strategically selecting candidates and maybe even becoming a party that now is willing to appeal to masses. Now they have increased their votes.
Mehmet, right? you raise a lot of talking points, but we do only have half an hour. So let's just boil that down and talk to Ege Seckin in London. Ege, let's just talk first about the handling of the financial crisis, or his critics would say the mishandling of the country's financial crisis.
Well, of course, that was, most people would argue, the single most important factor determining the outcome we saw on Sunday. We saw that the government in Turkey had for a long time delaying what some would argue to be an inevitable outcome, kicking the can down the road, if you will, and seeking to keep the clockworks of the economy going for just a few months longer to get through yet another election. But there was a point at which I think that strategy started to fail. And we saw the result of that in the local elections over the weekend. Now, the advantage that Turkey has is the fact that there is this unprecedented 4-year-long period in which there will be no election contest. And that gives the government a very good opportunity to undertake some of the more structural reforms that the economy desperately needs, and that could potentially provide the government with let's say, a sense of having dealt with some of its past mistakes in the lead up to the next round of elections in 2023.
Ozgur in Ankara, give us a sense for you of what the opposition did to go from their starting position to having this much traction within the political scene of Turkey.
Sure, Peter, but I would like to first say that actually the scene that we are seeing is not a landslide increase in the opposition's votes or a landslide decrease in the AK Party plus MHP's votes. We see just a little bit shift away from the Nation Alliance from the People Alliance to the Nation Alliance in certain cities and districts. There are, of course, a couple of reasons why this has happened. As Mehmet has said, first of all, the opposition or the Nation Alliance has managed to nominate candidates that appeal to a wider society, including some of the voters of the governing coalition. But apart from that, they also managed to craft an alliance that appeals to masses, on top of the alliance that they had forged during the presidential election between the main opposition Republican People's Party and the newly founded İYİ Party. They managed to bring on board the Kurdish HDP, but voluntarily, without giving back anything. And it was this Kurdish vote, for example, that made a difference in many of the cities. If we take Istanbul as an example, for simplicity, during the last presidential election, President Erdogan's vote in Istanbul was only 3.5% more than the sum of his competitors, including Selahattin Demirtas, the president of the Kurdish party. So when these three parties came together, there was only 3.5% vote difference with the AK party.
Okay, just let me interrupt you there for a second, Ozgur, because what you're saying, of course, statistically is a very accurate interpretation of how the numbers, how we can unpack the numbers. But the reality is, surely can I suggest to you, and it's this, that the opposition starting, or their starting point, was a starting point defined by everything being stacked against them because of what Mr. Erdogan did in the aftermath of the failed military coup. You know, voices of dissent have disappeared. Journalism is operating in a difficult environment in Turkey still. So their starting point was not as easy as perhaps you would like to say it is.
Peter, then let me say it in this way. President Erdogan has been using polarization for a very long time to galvanize his own voter base. But he didn't realize that in doing so, he was also galvanizing and consolidating the opposition in a way that they themselves would not be able to do if it wasn't for President Erdogan's help.
Mehmet, Celik in Istanbul. What does this tell us about how politically savvy Mr. Erdogan is now or not? I mean, putting out government-sponsored vegetable stalls obviously didn't get traction with anyone. People were, it would appear, able to see right through that.
I mean, if we're talking about President Erdogan's leadership, I think there's no questions there. President Erdogan has been the leader of AK Party since it was founded, but he has also been the leader of a very traditional voter base in Turkey, and that is the center-right vote in Turkey. And the fact that he has been able to consolidate the center-right voters, be it under national tendencies or be it under more conservative tendencies or be it through his tangible projects that he has brought into Turkey, be it through consolidating even the Kurdish votes in the southeast provinces, I think his leadership is undamaged at the moment. However, there is something that Erdogan himself is also saying, and he has said it. He has said the same thing when the party received about 40% during parliamentary elections. That the fact that the party itself needs to be continually adjusting itself to the needs of voters or to the demands of voters. And this is what they will. I'm thinking they will do going forward, starting from this week. That there will be shufflings. I'm thinking will be done in the cabinet or in the party administration. However, in the eyes of the people, Erdogan is someone who can make a FaceTime call and gather millions out to defeat a military coup or a coup attempt. Erdogan is a leader who people, regardless of their political ideology, when it becomes a national matter, they stick to. So in that sense, his leadership and his party leadership, I don't think is at question at the moment. However, there is a question. There is also, the criticism or maybe some sort of demands unmet by the party executives or other administration. However, people make a separation between the party and Erdogan in this sense. However, when it comes
Mehmet,
to...
I just want to put that point to Ege Seckin in London. So Ege, he's got to, in effect, reshuffle his government, keep his party together, because there are rumours not of a split within the party, but certainly the beginnings of what might be a fracturing effect, if you will. But he's also got to keep the country together. And on top of that, he's got to now, because the elections are past and the presidential election is more than a couple of years away, he's got to drill down into the issues of the economy, because there's no money literally in the bank.
It's a very difficult task that lies ahead of the president, that's for sure. There is the economy that will continue bleeding, and some painful adjustments are necessary, and that has been clear for a long time now. Turkey can no longer continue with the credit-fueled growth model that has been the case for a long time now, since the AKP came into power. That model simply needs to change, and that will entail pain in the short term. And it's a question of whether the political authorities or Mr. Erdogan himself have the patience to go through that. And beyond that, there's also geopolitical challenges lying ahead. the situation with the U.S., what I view as a brewing crisis regarding Turkey's continued desire to purchase S-400 missile defense systems from Russia, that will also be problematic for the Turkish economy because, for example, relations with the U.S. is an indicator which international investors really take into account in terms of basing their decisions on what to do with Turkey. And that will definitely be something that weighs down on the economy in the one-year outlook.
Ozgur in Ankara, could it just be that after, 6 votes in 5 years, the electorate in Turkey are just tired of him? And if he's got political savvy, if he's got political weight behind him still, he's got to engage with that idea.
Peter, I'm still concerned that we may be over-interpreting this vote because if there was a landslide loss in the votes of the AK party, we could have said that, but it's not the case. It's a small shift. And it wasn't about President Erdogan. These elections were about who will provide municipal services to the people and not who will govern the country. But of course, it's President Erdogan and his ally Devlet Bahçeli that turned these elections into an issue of national existence that legitimizes such questions. But I think that would be an overinterpretation. What we see here is that not among the supporters of President Erdogan, but among his opponents, they are so tired of him that they now look over their differences and can unite. Otherwise, how could a secular nationalist party, a hardcore nationalist party, an Islamist party, and a Kurdish nationalist party come together? Actually, their tiredness of President Erdogan is now bringing them together. And this is a huge challenge for President Erdogan in the future, because in the past, polarization always worked in his favor. Through polarization, he could conduct a bigger vote share than his opponents. But now through the polarization created by President Erdogan, the opposition seems to have tilted the balance. And this is a challenge for him.
Ege, looking forward to that next election, the presidential election, does he have one part of his political DNA which the opposition don't obviously have at the moment? And it might be, can I suggest to you this, he is a gut politician. He is instinctive. He's survived this long for a reason.
He is a political mastermind, and I don't think even his opponents have any doubts about that. But there are structural developments that could make things more difficult for him. The economy is one of them. And I agree with Özgür about his point about the opposition finally managing to look over their differences. And I would reinforce the point about there not having been that much of a change in terms of support levels for one side or the other. The voters, to a great extent in Turkey, are still locked within what I would call identity groups. So the Islamists, more broadly, or that is, of course, a simplifying term, the conservative segment of the population still voting for Erdogan and the AKP, and vice versa. And the minor shifts we see between those groups have, of course, resulted in the big changes that we saw in the election over the weekend. But when it comes to the next presidential election, Erdogan is still leading by far, and we are yet to see a politician that could rival him, especially when it comes to that gut instinct that you were referring to.
OK, Mehmet in Istanbul. So clearly he's still the most popular politician in Turkey, bar none. There is a slightly unpredictable disconnect between his popularity in relation to his party's popularity. But for the opposition, if he is vulnerable, how does the opposition build on that? Because presumably they're now looking to the presidential elections as well.
That unity among the opposition is not it's not an organic unity. Of course, I mean, we're not looking for organic unity among the politicians, but if we look at their voters base, that unity that comes from being anti-Erdogan is not a very sustainable unity in the long run. I mean, now we're talking about a Kurdish. I don't want to label them as that, but the so-called Kurdish supporting party, the HDP, on one hand, and we have the far-right nationalists on the other. I mean, how can that be sustainable in the long run and challenge a leader that has unified more than 50% being Erdogan. I mean, the opposition in the short term is united at the moment, but I don't think that's a very sustainable one. This has worked in the local elections because simply they can nominate candidates that will appeal to certain districts or provinces. But I think in the presidential or parliamentary elections, that unity is not very sustainable. It will be creating some sort of intra-alliance rifts, giving these ideological differences. However, Erdogan needs to still tackle the economy to sustain his and maintain his popularity. Some of the reformal and structural changes needs to be implemented, and his party needs to also adjust and be able to answer the demands of the people. And I think one of the strengths our party has had so far is the fact that they're in a continuous change to maintain their political momentum in the eyes of the people.
Okay.
And one of the weaknesses of the opposition is not to maintain that.
Okay, Ozgur, he's always kind of pitched himself or spun himself as being the guarantor of prosperity that's always just around the corner. Going forward in the next, say, year or 18 months, when, say, he goes to the IMF and the IMF say, no, actually, we won't give you any money, you've got to get it from someplace else, how does he build on that? How does he get prosperity into the economy?
Well, first of all, would President Erdogan approach the IMF despite everything he has said about former politicians who have worked with the IMF? Yes, he would, because at the end of the day, he's a pragmatist and there are no elections. At least there are no planned elections for the next 4 years. But he would, the first step of approaching the IMF would be behind the curtains negotiations, and he would not make it public before he has green light from the IMF. And he would go to IMF only and if only there is a very serious situation and the alternative would be a heavy crisis in Turkey. Well, if that is the situation, nobody has an interest in a bankrupting Turkey. So I do not think that IMF would turn him empty-handed. So I think that if there is a serious crisis in Turkey, President Erdogan will approach the IMF and IMF will not turn him empty-handed.
Ege Seckin in London. Generally, any president or prime minister that tries to push through policies of austerity, regardless of how safe they are politically or not, there's a very short shelf life for a politician that stays with austerity. Will his popularity now dip as he zeroes in on turning around the economy?
Structural reforms for the economy will entail pain, and that is likely to have an impact on Erdogan's popularity. But whether that will be enough to bring him down, I think that's the question. My personal view is that Erdogan remains very popular. He still does have the support of the 50%. And he has some political capital in that sense that he could spend for pushing through these reforms. In fact, his longer-term political survival depends on it, because if Turkey's economic story is not transformed and Turkey does not re-enter a growth spurt, that does not bode well for Erdogan's longer-term political future and whatever he wants to achieve in the country beyond the 4-year outlook.
Last question to Mehmet Celik in Istanbul. Given all these problems, Mehmet, is Turkey now heading into a better place over the next, 2 years or not? Because after that 2-year period, we're then heading towards the presidential election a couple of years after that.
Look, I mean, something that traditionally has happened in Turkey is what changes after? Will there be a new Turkey after the elections? That question always rises. The question, I mean, as soon as the elections are over, the life goes back to normal. However, whether or not it will go back to good or worse will depend, of course, on short to midterm reforms the government will implement. I just want to touch upon something that we were discussing in the previous question with regards to IMF or other bodies that may use some of their policies against Erdogan. Erdogan, at the moment he becomes vulnerable, or due to an external factor, people rally around him. And I think, be it the US with the F-35s or be it IMF, if they choose to take a step against Erdogan, I think that works against what they try to achieve if that is the weakening of Erdogan.
Okay.
Because people
Mehmet,
see that
we
as a
are out
national
of time,
interest.
for which I apologise. So I'm going to have to bring our conversation to a close. But thank you to all our guests. They were Mehmet, Ege Seckin and Ozgur Ulun Isacikli. And thank you to you too for your company. You can see the programme again anytime via the website aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also talk to us on Twitter @AJ Inside Story, or I'm @PeterDobbie1. From me, Peter Dobbie, and the entire team here in Doha. The news is next. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.